Monsters in Chernobyl are real. A man disappeared in Pripyat 3 days after the Chernobyl accident. April 30th, 1986, 3 days after the explosion at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, a man sneaked into the exclusion zone. A week later, his body was found near a railway embankment. His clothes were torn to shreds, and there were deep lacerations on his chest. His eyes were wide open, covered with a strange leaden film on the pupils. Experts wrote in their report, "The wounds do not correspond to animal attacks. The mechanism of their formation remains unknown." Next to the body were footprints of bare feet with unnaturally long toes, pressed 3 centimeters into the ground. Officially, the death was attributed to radiation and a structural collapse, but everyone who saw the body was ordered to stay silent. The materials were classified, and the case was closed in just 2 weeks. What killed Alexander Kovalchuk that night in the dead forest of Chernobyl? And why are the authorities still hiding the truth? On April 26, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., an explosion occurred at the 4th power unit of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. The reactor was destroyed, the roof collapsed, and an enormous amount of radioactive material was released into the atmosphere. Fire broke out. Hundreds of people rushed to extinguish the flames, not yet understanding the scale of the disaster. By morning it became clear. This was not just an accident. It was a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. On April 27th, the evacuation of the city of Pripyat began. Residents were told it was a temporary measure for 3 days. They should take only the bare minimum and leave everything else behind. People left, not knowing they would never return. Alexander Kovalchuk had worked as a mechanic at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant for 4 years. He was 34 years old and lived in Pripyat with his wife Irina and their 7-year-old son Denis. On the night of the accident, he was off duty. He learned about the explosion in the morning when panic broke out in the city. His shift was called to the plant to help with the cleanup. Alexander also wanted to go, but he was told to wait for orders. On the afternoon of April 27th, the evacuation was announced. Alexander, Irina, and Denis boarded a bus. They were taken to Kiev and placed in a dormitory. Alexander was in shock. He had left everything in Pripyat: documents, money, valuables. At work, in a storeroom near the 3rd block, lay his tools, an expensive set he had collected over the years. There was also a metal box containing family photographs and his military ID. He could not simply abandon them. On April 28th and 29th, Alexander tried to get permission to return to the zone. He was refused. The zone was closed. Access was allowed only to military personnel and liquidators. He insisted, saying he needed his documents. They told him everything would be taken out later, when the situation stabilized. But Alexander knew the truth. He had heard from former colleagues that the radiation levels at the plant were off the charts, that people who had worked in the first hours after the accident were already being rushed to Moscow with acute radiation sickness, and that no one was going to sort through personal belongings in the zone. Everything would remain there forever. On the evening of April 29th, Alexander met his friend Viktor Semyonov, who also worked at the plant. They sat in a small cafe near the dormitory. Viktor later told investigators that Alexander looked determined. He said he would go back alone, without permission, retrieve his things, and return within a day. Viktor tried to talk him out of it. There were soldiers, patrols, and lethal radiation in the zone. Alexander would not listen. He said he knew secret routes into Pripyat. He had worked there for 4 years and knew every road. Viktor asked how he planned to protect himself from radiation. Alexander pulled out a homemade dosimeter he had built from spare parts before the accident. He was into electronics, and showed a respirator he had taken from work earlier. He said it would be quick. Go in, grab the things, get out. Maximum 2 hours. Viktor disapproved but understood. He had also left valuables in Pripyat. But he lacked the courage to go. He asked Alexander not to take the risk. Alexander said he had already decided. They said goodbye around 10 p.m. That was the last time Viktor saw his friend alive. On April 30th, 1986, early in the morning, Alexander Kovalchuk left Kiev. He did not tell his wife where he was going. He said he was going to sort out some document issues and would be back in the evening. Irina suspected nothing. Alexander reached Chernobyl by hitchhiking. Drivers were heading there with supplies for the liquidators. He did not say he planned to enter the zone. He claimed he worked at the plant and needed to report. He was dropped off at a checkpoint 10 kilometers from Pripyat around noon. From there, he walked on foot, avoiding patrols moving through the forest. He knew the area well. Before the accident, he had often gone fishing nearby. By evening, he reached the outskirts of Pripyat. The city was empty. Silence, only the wind. Abandoned items, toys, and baby carriages lay on the streets. Alexander walked quickly and did not stop. The dosimeter clicked frequently, showing elevated radiation, but nothing critical. He put on the respirator and headed toward the industrial zone. Around 8 p.m. on April 30th, a military patrol noticed a man on the road leading to the plant's industrial site. It was Alexander. He was walking alone in civilian clothes with a backpack on his back. The patrol wanted to detain him and shouted for him to stop. Alexander ran. The soldiers did not pursue him. The zone was too dangerous. Running there was forbidden. One could step on heavily contaminated ground. The patrol recorded the incident in their report but did not attach much importance to it. They decided it was a looter or a local resident who had returned for his belongings. There had been several such cases in the first days after the evacuation. They were usually caught on the way out and sent back. But Alexander never came out. On May 1st, Irina Kovalchuk began to worry. Her husband had not returned since the evening of April 30th. She called everyone she knew, asking if anyone had seen Alexander. No one had. She went to the police and reported him missing. The Kiev police took the statement but said that chaos reigned at the moment. Many people had gone missing after the evacuation. They told her to wait a few days. Irina insisted. They calmed her down and promised to start searching. On May 2nd, Viktor Semyonov learned from Irina that Alexander was missing. He immediately understood that his friend had gone to Pripyat as planned. Viktor went to the police and told them about the conversation on April 29th. He said Alexander had intended to return to the zone for his belongings. This changed everything. The case was transferred to a special department that handled violations of the exclusion zone regime. Searches began. On May 3rd, a group of soldiers and police started examining the territory of Pripyat and the areas around the plant. The searches were limited because of the extremely high radiation levels. People worked in protective suits with dosimeters and in short shifts of only 20 to 30 minutes. They checked the main buildings, roads, and industrial zone. Alexander was not found. There were no traces of his presence. One officer suggested that Kovalchuk might have received a lethal dose of radiation, lost consciousness somewhere in a hidden spot, or perhaps left the zone by another route. On May 4th, the searches were expanded. More people were brought in. They checked the forest belt around the city, the bank of the Pripyat River, and abandoned dachas. No results. On May 5th, one of the searchers, Army Sergeant Oleg Tkachenko, found a backpack near the railway embankment between Pripyat and the plant. The backpack was empty, the zippers open, the straps torn. There was nothing inside. Tkachenko called the others. They examined the surrounding area and found footprints in the soft soil near the embankment. Strange footprints. Not from boots or shoes, bare feet, but the shape was wrong. Too elongated, with long toes, unnatural. The depth of the prints was about 3 centimeters, as if the person had been extremely heavy or had jumped from a height. Tkachenko photographed the tracks with an army camera. The dosimeter showed elevated radiation, but nothing critical. The group continued searching along the embankment. On May 6th, the searches focused on the railway section. They checked every meter, looked under the embankment, and searched the ditches and bushes. By evening, they had found nothing. The group commander wanted to stop the searches. The accumulated radiation dose for the men was becoming too high, but they decided to give it one more day. On the morning of May 7th, around 9 o'clock, military dosimetrist Sergei Lebedev was checking radiation levels along the embankment. In one spot, the device began clicking faster. Lebedev approached. A source of radiation. Bushes at the foot of the embankment. He parted the branches and saw the body. Alexander Kovalchuk lay on his back, arms spread, legs bent. His clothes were ripped, the jacket in tatters, the shirt torn open across the chest. The trousers were intact but heavily soiled with earth and something dark that looked like blood. There were no shoes, his feet were bare and dirty. Lebedev stepped back and called the others on the radio. 10 minutes later, the entire search team had gathered at the site. The commander, Major Igor Savchenko, examined the body from several meters away. He immediately realized that Kovalchuk was dead. The face was pale, the lips blue, the eyes open and glazed. Savchenko ordered no one to approach until the medical experts and photographer arrived. The area was cordoned off and temporary radiation warning signs were placed. The dosimeter showed 350 roentgens per hour, 3 times higher than in neighboring sections of the embankment. This was strange. There were no reactor fragments, contaminated equipment, or metal nearby. By noon, a group of experts from Kiev arrived. A doctor, a photographer, and 2 criminologists. They put on reinforced protective suits and approached the body. The photographer took pictures from different angles. The doctor performed a preliminary examination. The body was in rigor mortis. Death had occurred approximately 4 to 5 days earlier, the evening of April 30th or the morning of May 1st. There were multiple ragged wounds on the chest and arms, deep and uneven, as if the tissue had been torn with tremendous force. But the character of the wounds was strange. The doctor, Lieutenant Colonel of the Medical Service Anatoly Vlasenko, later wrote in his report, "The edges of the wounds show signs of thermal damage. The tissue is charred, and the blood has coagulated instantly. This is possible with exposure to extremely high temperature or intense radiation. However, typical radiation burns look different. The affected area is large and superficial. Here the wounds are deep and localized, as if inflicted by a sharp, heated object. There were also injuries on the neck, dark stripes resembling strangulation marks, but neither from hands nor from a rope. Vlasenko could not determine what had caused them. Alexander's face was contorted. His mouth was open as if he had screamed. His eyes were wide open, the pupils covered with a strange leaden film. Vlasenko had never seen anything like it. He took a sample of the eye tissue for analysis. The clothing was torn, not cut. The fabric had been ripped as if pulled with enormous force. There were bloodstains on the jacket and shirt, but far less than there should have been with such wounds, as if the blood had not flowed out completely or had coagulated almost immediately. There were no shoes. Vlasenko examined the feet. They were dirty and scratched but without serious injuries. It looked as if Alexander had walked barefoot for only a short time. The criminologists examined the area around the body. They found a charred piece of fabric a meter away. The fabric was thick, similar to the material of a chemical protection suit, but badly burned, almost completely destroyed. They took a sample. They also found the same strange footprints discovered on May 5th. The prints led from the body toward the forest, 10 to 12 impressions, then stopped on hard ground. The criminologists photographed the tracks and measured them. The length of each print was 28 centimeters. The width at the widest point was 11 centimeters. There were 5 elongated toes, but their arrangement was odd. The big toe was on the side like a human's, but the other 4 were far too long and almost the same length. One of the criminologists, Captain Pyotr Drozdov, told his colleagues that he had seen such footprints only once before, on a person with a rare genetic bone deformity. But here there were multiple identical prints. It was highly unlikely that they belonged to a real person with such a deformity. Alexander Kovalchuk's body was placed in a zinc coffin right on the spot. This was standard procedure for anyone who died in the zone with high radiation levels. The coffin was sealed and taken to the morgue in Kiev. On May 8th, Vlasenko performed a full autopsy. The results were even stranger. Alexander's internal organs showed signs of radiation exposure. The lungs were damaged, the liver enlarged, the spleen dark, but the calculated radiation dose was only about 400 to 500 roentgens. That is a high dose capable of causing radiation sickness, but not instantly lethal. A person could live for several days or even weeks with such a dose, yet Alexander had died quickly. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. The heart showed signs of acute failure, probably caused by extreme stress or shock. The wounds on the chest and arms were examined in detail. Vlasenko wrote, "The injuries do not correspond to animal attacks. There are no bite or claw marks typical of tearing. The wounds were inflicted by something that left clean, deep cuts with thermal effects. The instrument is unknown." Analysis of the eye tissue sample showed that the film consisted of coagulated protein and particles of metal, lead and other heavy elements. Where they came from in the eyes was unclear. Vlasenko suggested it was the result of extremely intense radiation combined with some chemical reaction. On May 9th, The autopsy results were handed to the investigator in charge of the case. Police Major Valery Romanenko studied the materials and began questioning witnesses. He met with Viktor Semyonov, Alexander's friend. Viktor repeated his story about the conversation on April 29th and added that Alexander had been a determined man but not reckless. He would not have gone into the zone if he had considered it suicide. That meant he had been confident he could handle it. Romanenko also questioned the military patrol that had seen Alexander on the evening of April 30th. The soldiers confirmed they had seen a man on the road to the industrial site around 8 p.m. The man ran when they shouted. They had not seen him again. Romanenko went to the zone and examined the site where the body was found. The dosimeter still showed an abnormally high radiation level in that exact spot. He asked physicists to explain why the background was higher there. They answered that perhaps contaminated debris or equipment had once lain there and had later been removed. But no one remembered anything being in that location. Romanenko also studied the photographs of the footprints. He showed them to several experts: biologists, anthropologists, and criminologists. None could give a clear answer. One anthropologist said the shape of the print resembled a human foot but with pathological changes, possibly the tracks of a person with severe bone deformities. But Romanenko did not believe that version. 3 days after the catastrophe, a man with deformed feet wandering the zone, attacking Kovalchuk, killing him and leaving the body, it was absurd. On May 10th, Romanenko met with several liquidators who had worked in the zone during the first days after the accident. He asked if anyone had seen anything strange or unusual. One of the liquidators, Warrant Officer Nikolai Gritsenko, said that on the night of May 1st, while on duty near the 3rd block, they had heard strange sounds coming from the forest. Loud, sharp cries, not human and not animal. Something in between. The sounds lasted about 5 minutes and then stopped. Gritsenko and his comrades thought it was the wind or some machinery at the plant. Another liquidator, Sergeant Anatoly Moros, said that on the morning of May 2nd he had seen something moving near the railway embankment. A tall, thin silhouette moving quickly. Moros had been far away and could not make out details. He thought it was one of their own and paid no attention. A third witness, Private Ivan Kaftan, mentioned that on May 3rd he had found a dead dog near the road not far from Pripyat. The dog had been torn apart. The wounds were deep and almost no blood had flowed out. He thought it was wolves or feral dogs, but there were almost no wolves in the area, and feral dogs usually did not kill their own kind so viciously. Romanenko recorded all the statements. He realized the picture did not add up. Too many oddities, too little logic. On May 11th, Romanenko received an order to close the case. The call came from Kiev, from the regional administration. They told him the Kovalchuk case had to be completed as quickly as possible. The official version: death from a high radiation dose and injuries sustained in a structural collapse. No mention of the strange footprints, wounds of unknown origin, or witness accounts of screams in the forest. Romanenko tried to object. He said the investigation was not finished and there were too many unanswered questions. He was told harshly, "Exclusion zone, restricted facility. Information is limited. Any speculation or rumors could cause panic among the population. Close the case. That is an order." Romanenko hung up. He understood that further digging was useless. The system would not allow it. He wrote a brief conclusion, stated the official version, and signed the documents. The case was closed on May 12, 1986, but Romanenko did not throw away his notes. He kept copies of the witness statements, photographs of the footprints, and Vlasenko's conclusions. He hid everything in his personal archive just in case. On May 13th, Alexander Kovalchuk's family was informed of his death. Irina was devastated. She could not understand how her husband could have died in a collapse when he was an experienced mechanic who knew every dangerous place at the plant. She demanded to see the body. She was refused. The coffin was sealed. Could not be opened because of radioactive contamination. Viktor tried to find out the truth himself. He contacted several liquidators who had worked in the zone those days. Most refused to talk, they were afraid. One agreed to meet anonymously. It was Warrant Officer Nikolai Gritsenko, the same man who had heard the strange sounds on May 1st. They met at the end of May in a small cafe on the outskirts of Kiev. Gritsenko said he had been forbidden to talk about what he had seen and heard in the zone. He had signed a non-disclosure document, but he believed people should know the truth. Gritsenko told Viktor that in the first days after the accident strange things had happened in the zone. Equipment failed for no reason. Dosimeters showed anomalous radiation spikes in places with no sources. Animals behaved strangely. Dogs howled at night, birds flew away, and even the rats disappeared from the basements of Pripyat. On May 2nd, while Gritsenko and his group patrolled near the third block, they found a dead cow by the road. The cow had not been evacuated and had stayed in the zone. Its body had been torn apart, but not in the way wolves do it. The wounds were deep and clean, and almost no blood had flowed out. One soldier said it looked like the result of a high-voltage electric shock. Blood coagulates instantly in such cases. On May 3rd, Gritsenko saw something near the forest. He was on duty on the roof of an administrative building, watching through binoculars. Around midnight, he noticed movement at the edge of the woods. Something tall and thin moved between the trees. Neither human nor animal. The silhouette was strange. Broad at the top, narrow at the bottom, moving in jerks. Gritsenko lost sight of it after a few seconds. He reported it to the commander. The commander said it was probably a shadow from equipment or an optical illusion. Visibility was poor at night in the zone, and everyone was tired and stressed. Gritsenko did not insist. On May 4th, one of the soldiers in their group, Private Sergei Kulik, disappeared for several hours. He had gone to check radiation sensors near the railway embankment and did not return on time. They searched for him for 2 hours and found him in a ditch unconscious. He woke up in the medical station with no memory. He said he had seen a bright flash and then blacked out. The doctors decided he had suffered heat stroke or overexposure and sent him to the hospital. Gritsenko told Viktor that after the Kovalchuk incident everyone had been forbidden to speak about the anomalies. Officers said it was classified information and disclosure would be punished. Several soldiers signed non-disclosure agreements. Gritsenko had signed one too, but he decided the truth was more important. Viktor wrote down everything Gritsenko told him. He did not know what to do with the information. Showing it to the authorities, they would not believe him. Telling journalists it would be classified. In June 1986, Viktor tried to contact the Dr. Vlasenko who had performed Kovalchuk's autopsy. Vlasenko refused to meet and said over the phone that everything was written in the official report and there was nothing more to discuss.
Viktor insisted.
Vlasenko finally agreed to a short conversation, but only in an unofficial setting. They met in a park far from other people. Vlasenko was nervous and kept looking around. He told Viktor that after Kovalchuk's autopsy, people from Moscow had come. They did not introduce themselves, showed KGB IDs, confiscated all the tissue samples he had taken, seized his personal notes and photographs, and said the case was classified. Any mention of the details was prohibited. Vlasenko had tried to object, saying it was a medical document and he had the right to a copy. They told him he had no rights in matters of national security. If he told anyone about the autopsy details, he would be held accountable. Vlasenko was frightened. He rewrote the report, removing all the strange details and leaving only the official version. Death from radiation and trauma. He destroyed the rest, but he told Viktor that he remembered everything. The wounds were not from a collapse. He had worked as a medical examiner for 20 years and had seen thousands of bodies. He had never seen wounds like these. Thermal damage, but not from fire or explosion, from something else. And the eyes. The leaden film on the pupils. Vlasenko had checked the literature. Such a thing occurs only with extremely intense radiation combined with a chemical reaction. But where would a chemical reaction come from in the forest near a railway embankment? Vlasenko told Viktor he did not know what had killed Kovalchuk. But it was not a collapse or ordinary radiation, it was something else. Viktor thanked Vlasenko and left. He understood that the truth would never be known officially. The authorities had closed the case, classified the materials, and forced the witnesses to stay silent. In July, Viktor learned that the criminologist Pyotr Drozdov, who had examined the footprints at the discovery site, had died of acute radiation sickness. Drozdov had worked in the zone for several weeks and received a high dose. He was taken to Moscow to a specialized clinic and died a month later. The photographer who had taken pictures of the discovery site and the footprints also fell ill with moderate radiation sickness. He survived but remained disabled. The photographs he had taken were confiscated along with all the case materials. Liquidator Anatoly Moroz, who had seen the silhouette near the embankment on May 2nd, died in August. The cause of death was complications from radiation exposure. He was buried in his hometown. A small ceremony, few people. Warrant Officer Gritsenko was transferred to another unit in September. Victor tried to contact him, but the phone no longer answered. Later he learned that Gritsenko had signed yet another non-disclosure document and had been warned about the consequences of breaking it. Soldier Sergei Kulik, who had disappeared for several hours on May 4th, was discharged from the army for health reasons. He suffered from memory loss, headaches, and nervous disorders. Doctors diagnosed the consequences of acute radiation exposure and psychological shock. By the end of 1986, all the witnesses had either died, fallen silent, or disappeared from sight. The Kovalchuk case was buried along with dozens of other strange incidents that had occurred in the exclusion zone in the first weeks after the catastrophe. Viktor Semyonov kept his notes secret. He showed them to no one, fearing the consequences. Only in 2006, 20 years after the events, did he give an interview to an independent journalist who was researching little-known facts about Chernobyl. Viktor told everything he knew. The journalist published an article in a small regional publication. The article caused no resonance. Most readers took it as just another urban legend. Do Chernobyl mutants really exist? Official science says no. Radiation does not cause instant mutations that turn animals into monsters. DNA changes require generations. Everything people say about strange creatures in the zone is legend, folklore, the fears of frightened people. But there are facts that cannot be ignored. Alexander Kovalchuk died in the exclusion zone under strange circumstances. His body was found with wounds of unknown origin. Next to it were footprints of bare feet with deformed toes. The dosimeter showed an anomalously high radiation level in a place with no contamination sources. Witnesses heard strange sounds, saw silhouettes, and found dead animals with unusual wounds. All of this was documented. Photographs of the footprints exist. Vlasenko's medical report existed, although it was later seized. Witness statements were recorded. The authorities classified the case, forced witnesses to stay silent, and destroyed the evidence. Why? If it was an ordinary accident, why hide the details? One researcher of anomalous phenomena who studied the Kovalchuk case materials put forward a theory. He suggested that in the first days after the accident, the radiation levels in the zone were so high that they could cause not only radiation sickness in people and animals but also temporary mutations at the cellular level. Animals that received superlethal doses did not die immediately. Some lived for several days or weeks. During that time, their bodies could change. Bone deformation, altered behavior, aggression. Creatures that were no longer ordinary dogs, wolves, or other animals. Something in between, alive but transformed. This theory has no scientific confirmation. Biologists say such rapid changes are impossible. But no one knows exactly what happens to living organisms when exposed to tens of thousands of Röntgens. Such conditions existed nowhere except Chernobyl. Perhaps Alexander Kovalchuk encountered such a creature. Perhaps it was a dog or a wolf that had received a lethal dose, deformed, aggressive, dying. The creature attacked him and inflicted the wounds. Kovalchuk tried to defend himself, perhaps firing a homemade weapon or something he had taken with him. The creature fled, and Kovalchuk died from shock and radiation. The monsters of Chernobyl are real, and the authorities have been hiding the truth for 40 years.